Welcome to Alzheimer Speaks Radio. I'm your host, Lori LeBay, and I'm so excited that you're joining us today. We are going to have a fascinating conversation as usual as we learn from people all around the world at all ages and stages of life. Stay tuned as we shift our dementia care from crisis to comfort.
Here we go. What you think about, you will bring about dementia change. We will.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining Alzheimer Speaks today. I'm your host, Lori LeBay. We are going to be talking with Barry Jacobs and Julie Myers. They are the authors of the book, the AARP Caregiver Answer Book. And there's about 150 different common questions that people have. And these two are going to tackle some of those for us and tell us a little bit more about that. But before we go there, I just want to encourage everyone to check out Alzheimer Speaks and all of our free educational resources. We have a special tab just for that, as well as our sister company, Dementia Map, where you can find all kinds of resources around the world that can help you live graciously with dementia. So let's go ahead and introduce you to our guests. Well, Barry and Julia, I am so excited to have you on the show. This book that you have written, I've been kind of waiting to see. So many people have questions about caregiving, and to hear from two individuals who really specialize in this and have a good understanding, I think it's going to be fabulous for my audience. So thank you for taking the time with us today.
Thank you, Lori. This is our pleasure.
I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves. So Barry, if you want to go first.
Sure. So I am a clinical psychologist. I'm also a healthcare consultant for a national healthcare consulting firm. I'm married to Julia. We've been married as of
next week.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. 35 wonderful years. And we have been focusing on the needs of older adults and family caregivers for 30 plus years, each of us in our work. And Julie and I have written 3 AARP branded books together, 2 of them on family caregiving, and I had written a previous book on family caregiving. And our latest book, just released, is the AARP Caregiver Answer Book.
Okay, thank you. Julia, you want to give us a little background?
Yes, I'm also a clinical psychologist. And as Barry said, we've been practicing for decades, and more and more seeing caregivers in our practice, as well as, because of these books and presentations we've given, all our neighbors come over to us with caregiving questions. We are constantly being asked questions. So it is our pleasure to have this book come out so that we can help answer questions, from people who don't know us.
It's so interesting because people look at caregiving a lot of times as a burden. And I always, try to phrase caregiving and change people's perspective that we're a caregiver, care companion, carer from the moment we're born. We are consciously or unconsciously taking care of people in terms of how we react. And I think people forget that, how intertangled we are, if we want to be or not. And our roles change during the years in terms of what we want to step up and into, and sometimes our roles are more formal than not. But in our world of dementia, it's definitely a formal role, and a lot of times people kind of slide into it not knowing that that's the role they're playing. They're still a son, a daughter, a spouse, a friend. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. I always like to ask my guests if they've been personally touched by dementia in their own family or circle of friends. And Julia, I'll go first with you on this one.
Sure. My mother was my father's caregiver, and he had vascular dementia. She needed a surgery, which unfortunately, because of a rare side effect, killed her. And so suddenly my siblings and I were my father's caregivers. And he lived 3 hours away from me across the country from one of my brothers. We had to work together to take care of my dad. And then after he passed away, and Barry will talk more about this, we took care of Barry's stepfather who had Alzheimer's and his mother who also had vascular dementia.
And Barry, I'll let you go ahead and add on to that.
Yeah, so my first experience actually with someone with cognitive difficulties was my dad, who had brain cancer. He developed brain cancer when I was 14, and his first symptom was a common symptom for people who have a loved one with dementia, and that is he had aphasia. He was unable to use language. And so that really had a big impression on me very early on in my life, and has it's kind of set this path before me of helping families care for loved ones with dementia. And then, as Julie mentioned, my stepfather and mother were living in a wonderful gated golf community in Florida, living the good life. And then my stepfather slowly over time developed Alzheimer's disease. My mother was very frail and really had a hard time caring for him. And so we moved the two of them up to live in an apartment about a mile from us in 2010. And we then proceeded to take care of the two of them for the next 7 years. My stepfather died after a few years, and my mother slowly developed her own vascular dementia. So we had a 7 year experience, which was very arduous, but it was also extremely gratifying. And so that helps inform what we know about dementia caregiving.
Definitely.
Well, and I think, people forget about the positive side, of this. I had my mom lived with dementia for 30 years. My dad had brain cancer as well. Gave him a year and a half, lived 4.5 years. But what was really interesting, I heard from my friends, and I don't know if you guys heard this, but my friends actually would say, I'm kind of jealous of you. You have stories about your parents, and you know your parents on a whole different level that I don't know mine because they're well. And it was just, and I can't tell you how many people told me that, but I think part of it was because I, I wasn't just complaining about the journey and oh, we're going through this now, but I would tell them, the whole story of us, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so they framed that differently. But I had one woman who was just in tears going, I wish I could have cared for my parents. I wish I would have known my parents as intimately as you know yours.
Yeah, it really sounds like the caregiving brought you closer with your parents, and you probably already had close relationships with them beforehand. But caregiving became a time of life where you really forged even stronger bonds, and that's the real potential in caregiving. That especially when we're caregiving for our parents, that we come to know them in a different way. We see them as vulnerable rather than as domineering, perhaps. And so it sounds like you had a very good experience. And I would hope every caregiver would have an experience like that.
Yeah, I always say that my journey was probably the biggest gift I'll ever receive in my life because what you learn through this process applies to so many different angles of your life. I mean, it's not just dementia related or cancer related or whatever. I mean, it's very applicable in my eyes in terms of how to communicate and what's important in a relationship. I mean, it really to me gets to the core of that. And so I've just been really lucky, I suppose, in terms of how I looked at everything, with that and so forth. I want to ask you each because you've been writing, you've been, working with your clients, you've been advocating for family caregivers, but what really led you to focus on the caregiver experience and write, so many books? And Barry, I'll throw this to you first.
I mentioned my dad had brain cancer, and my family went through an extremely tough time, as I'm sure your family did. My father had been an attorney. He'd been a litigator, so he was accustomed to standing in court and arguing. And then the first symptom is he can't use language anymore. So then he's out of work. My mother has to work two jobs to try to compensate for his loss of income. And so our family went through a very difficult economic time, a very difficult emotional time. Then my dad died after a year, and there was a lot of dissension in my family, a lot of arguing between my mother and my father's mother over what my dad's treatment should be. And it had a very big impact on me at a really sensitive time in my life. I was 15 when my dad died, and it's not like at that moment I said I want to be a clinical psychologist specializing in family caregiving, but eventually it kind of led me to this place where working with family caregivers was extremely meaningful on a very personal level for me, and I wanted it to become my professional mission, and that's pretty much the way my career has been, whether I've been working clinically or working on healthcare policy or writing or doing public speaking. It's all for the same purpose, and that is helping families deal with these really trying circumstances in the life of the family. And they're not abnormal circumstances. I mean, many families go through this, but most folks don't like to think about bad things happening, and so they are unprepared. I want to help them, and Julia too. We want to help them prepare better and just not be lost in this process, and to really find it gratifying the way you found caring for your parents very gratifying.
Yeah, I think being able to help people take the scary out of it. This is normal. We're all going through it if we want to admit it or not at some level, and typically in multiple, points in our life. And, I kind of giggle sometimes because, and again, this doesn't happen to everyone, but I think, well, like when people get pregnant, there's such excitement, about, becoming a parent and da, 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 da. And again, not in everybody's case, but in a lot. And they walk into it with this joy. And you rarely do you hear that when somebody is ill. It's just like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? And, everything's going to change. And, to me, there's just beauty in all of life. But if you don't look for it, you're never going to find it. And so I think it's helping people direct them to feeling in control when they can be and going with the flow when they can't be. And again, the beauty in those detours. I mean, we've all been on journeys, even if we're on a road trip and it's like there's a detour and we're like, oh dang, we're gonna be late, and we're not gonna do this. And then all of a sudden you find this quaint little town, or you go into this little shop, and that's kind of how I relate to the caregiving experience. If you allow yourself to go with the flow, as long as everyone's being protected, there's a lot of cool things that you'll experience if you open the door to that. How about you, Julia? What led you to this, caregiving experience? I appreciate you both have this personal background and things, but I always find that sometimes there's a point or two in life, or I know when I look back at mine, I can look at boom, boom, boom. It's like scary how connected everything is. If I look at my life every 5 years of how I landed where I am, it's like, oh boy, that's almost a direct line, but I would never see that if I didn't look that deeply.
Absolutely. When when my mother needed this major surgery, valve replacement, bypass surgery, I was in my early 40s, and I was eager. My sister and I actually were very, really eager to take care of her and my dad while she was recovering, thinking that it was temporary, brief. And then when she passed away so suddenly, everyone was flattened with grief, my two brothers, my sister, and I. But and it did become an opportunity to take care of my dad and to have a relationship with him that I hadn't yet had. A lot of families are like this. The mom does all the talking and the dad's in the background. And that was my parents. And so when my mom was gone, it was me and my dad sitting at a table. And I had a year and a quarter of time where I could actually know him better and he could know me better. And it really was a very good relationship. And it made me feel very good about helping him. And my older brother, who did more care than I did, had had a terrible adolescence. He ran away from home. He got in trouble with the police. And this was an opportunity for him to take care of my dad and to sort of make up for some of the headache and heartache that he had caused. And it was very meaningful. So, you brought up that it can be a very positive experience. I have to say that in my family, we had our bumps along the way, but my siblings got along. And for the most part, my older brother really felt redeemed. And I felt like I finally had this chance to have time with my dad in a way that I hadn't before that.
And it's nice that your family let your brother in, because sometimes the black sheep of the family,
Yeah.
they're not allowed to re-enter, or once they're deemed that, they are always that. And I've seen people really struggle with that. So what a great opportunity to, see if things have changed.
He was the one my dad really wanted to care for him. It was nice.
Oh, that's really sweet. Now, you both mentioned that you've been caregivers for family. How the heck did that affect your marriage? I know, when I was married, my husband, he, like you had said, Julia, the woman kind of runs the house and does the talking. And he just kind of
Exactly.
followed it. Tom just was really good. He let me do what I needed to do and would support me or get out of the way, whatever I needed at the time. And was also right there, with my folks when I needed them. But how did you guys maneuver that? Julia, I'll let you go first.
Well, when I was caring for my dad, I was driving 3 hours each way every other weekend to take care of him and give my brother a break and my other siblings. And Barry and I had two teenage kids. One of them was getting ready to go to college, and it was a tough time for me to be away from them. But Barry absolutely stepped in and took care of them on those weekends. There was never a complaint. My kids were really good-natured about it too. So, in that instance, we really did fine. And then Barry may want to answer more of this one, but when we were taking care of his parents, we really made a pretty mindful effort I mean, we're two psychologists. We tried to talk to each other about what we were feeling, process some emotion, get some perspective, manage self-care if we could a little bit. So we did try to work together.
Great. Barry, what would you like to add on all that?
So I would say at the point at which we moved my mother and stepfather from Florida to live near us, I think I kind of threw myself into the caregiving role to such a degree that I was not available to Julia as a husband, and I wasn't available to our kids as a dad. And I mean, I was just, I wanted to make sure they had dinner every night. I wanted I was checking in on them constantly. I was very much focused on them. And if I had other things to do that took me away from them, I felt very guilty that I was being a bad son. And my wife, because she's a wonderful person as well as a psychologist, was able to kind of say to me, things are really a little out of balance now. You need to be home more. You need to spend time with me. You need to take care of yourself. I mean, she said she was able to make me realize that if I wanted to do the best job I could for my mother and stepfather, I had to do really sustain myself, and that meant also being a good dad and a good husband. And so I think that was extremely helpful to me. And then aside from that, I mean, Julie was right in there helping take care of them. I mean, she took them to the supermarket, she took them to doctor's appointments. Um, we had dinner with them at our house all the time. And Julia was cooking. I mean, it was um, Julia took this on as part of our family's responsibility, and so was she was emotionally supportive for me and was extremely supportive to my mother and stepfather, for which I was extremely grateful. And I think it really made our marriage very much stronger. I mean, I think our marriage was already very strong, but I had such admiration for her during that time. I still do.
It's interesting because people think of long distance caregiving and they get the drives or the flights and all of that. And Julie, you described all that, but then, here's Barry in town and you're just like blinded by everything that needs to be done. And I think one, because you're so close, and everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but you wanted to do a really good job. And I think that happened with me too. It was like I was so intense of because I did have a good relationship with my folks and I wanted them to be I'm going to cry, as well cared for as they cared for me. I mean, I really felt I owed that to them. And that was really important in it. So it's really easy to lose yourself in that process. And you think you're juggling everything, but you're not always doing it well. And I know for me, I didn't realize how much of myself I lost my husband wasn't a psychologist and wasn't a great communicator. He just kind of let me do what I do and kind of stayed out of the way. And until I kept pushing friends away. And one day, and my audience has heard this story, but it's just such a powerful story. And it's such an important one to have that balance and to be able to recognize it within yourself or within others who are caring. They had called me up every week, to go have coffee, and I just couldn't manage that. There's just no way. My schedule was packed. It's like, don't you see that? I'm working full time. I have a family. I have extra people living with me. Plus, I'm caring for my folks. I mean, the list just kind of goes on and on and on. And I'm like, how do they not see this? And I thought, okay, I'm going to give them 15 minutes of my time. And I'm going to go in and I'm kind of going to set them straight. That was my attitude. Like, don't call me again because I really don't even have time to take the call, was really my attitude. And these were such good friends. I ended up staying and we laughed and we cried for 2 hours. And it wasn't until I let myself be with them and they allowed me to be my obnoxious self who was on the edge, who I didn't even know I was on the edge because I'm a type A personality and I'm always in control, or so I thought, that I realized how empty I was and that I walked out full and I felt so much better. And I never missed a coffee after that, So thank God for Julia, to be able to talk to you, and thank God for my friends. It's important to help people see that because you don't see that in the mirror, or I didn't. I just saw my never ending to-do list in front of me, and I wanted so bad to do good by them. And I think that can be really, really common. And then there's others, and I'm sure you've run across this, where they haven't had a good relationship with who they're caring for. And, I mean, I wanted to step up. You guys wanted to step up, but not everybody wants to step up. And that's got to be even more difficult. How do you deal with those family dynamics? And do you have any advice for people out there that are struggling with their relationships and caring for someone who, to be quite honest, maybe they don't like, and maybe who never have, maybe who were never well cared for by them, and they have a hard time giving that back?
So we talk about how all caregivers make decisions about how the degree to which they're going to commit themselves to caregiving on the basis of how able they are, how available they are, and how willing they are. And even, there are people who are able to do certain things, but maybe not strong enough to pick up someone on the floor if they've fallen, or they have multiple responsibilities and have limited availability. But the willingness issue is the issue that you're really alluding to, Lori, and that is if they have had a bad relationship with a parent, they're not so inclined to take care of that parent, for instance, or other family member. And then what we talk about with them is what does caregiving, what could potentially caregiving mean to them? So when the relationship has historically been good, the purpose of caregiving to give back is extremely powerful. And you mentioned it yourself. For folks that aren't so motivated by giving back, they may still be motivated by wanting to do the morally right thing to do, or if they are someone of a strong religious persuasion, they may feel like this is God's work in this world. And so sometimes there are other motivations that people go ahead with caregiving almost in spite of the relationship that they've had in the past, not because of it. That said, there are also folks that will say, and I'm going to tell you a little story about my stepfather in a moment, that they'll do a little bit, but they're not going to do that much because they just don't feel available, able, and most especially, they're not willing. So I mentioned my dad died and my mother got remarried, and I never had a good relationship with my stepfather. He and I were very distant from one another, and if we weren't distant, we were in conflict. And so when it came time for caring for him with Alzheimer's dementia, I mean, Julie and I stepped up, but I also felt like I was committed to caring for his basic needs, food, shelter, security, getting him to doctors. But I wasn't I wasn't going to sit down with him and have conversations with him. I wasn't going to entertain him the way my mother would. And so in my mind, I kind of drew a limit. I'm not, I'm going to do what I think is the right thing to do for him, not because of my relationship with him in the past, but in spite of it. But I was also not going to extend myself beyond a certain point. And I do think that family members make those kinds of decisions. I'll do this, but not that. And that's okay. I really do think it's okay.
You know, I just want to add to that. One of the things that we often tell our clients or uh, anyone who asks actually is if you are caring for someone with whom you've had a not very good relationship, maybe your dad was an alcoholic, and even though he stopped drinking, your childhood has terrible memories, or maybe you had a neglectful, critical mother. When you're caring for them, when you make that commitment to care for them, you're caring for a person who is diminished. They're not the same person anymore. I mean, they're in there, but their illness or whatever it is that they're struggling with has changed them, and now they're vulnerable and fragile. And if a caregiver can think about it that way, it really helps because they can have a different relationship with this person now that this person is altered. And we've had really wonderful stories of people who had terrible relationships with their parents growing up and even in their younger years, but that during the caregiving years, the relationships were shifted and there was more respect, there was more mutual care, and the caregiver came away feeling like it was one of the most valuable things they'd ever done. I mean, it doesn't always happen that way, but that's the goal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me give the other side of that just to kind of show that there are many different ways for people to experience this. If someone was traumatized by, say, an abusive parent, an alcoholic parent, or physically or even sexually abusive parent, and now they're in a position where they're being asked to care for that person, the very idea of being tied to that person again may be re-traumatizing for them, and it just may be impossible for them to make that commitment. And with any clients that we have that have a history of trauma, we're always trying to help them understand that they may have been vulnerable to being victimized when they were particularly children or younger, but now they're a much more capable adult, and they're not going to be victimized again in that way. And so there are folks that even with terrible histories of having been abused by the person they're caring for are able to say that happened then, and as Julia points out, that the person who's before me now is not the same person. This is a vulnerable older adult who is like a toothless tiger at this point, and I can take care of this person because it's a right thing to do to take care of vulnerable people in this world, and I want to do it. And so it's possible, but it's often very hard.
Well, and if they're tied into a therapist to help support them, through this journey and recognizing that and familiar with boundaries and knowing that life's not perfect and, that they may change their mind. They might make one decision 1 second and another at another time. I think is all really important. And then you have people, and I hear this a lot from people like, boy, he was really a son of a bitch growing up, but I like this person because he's got frontal temporal lobe and his personality changed, or vice versa. Or what happened to my sweet mom? She's talking like a sailor and I can't believe it, so there's all those types of mixtures that run in, or even titles of who you're caring for. I am now caring for my ex-husband who doesn't have dementia, but he has a lot of health issues, and his wife who has major cognitive issues. And people, and I'm pretty much their primary caregiver, and people are like, how can you do that? Why would you do that? And I'm like, why wouldn't I? They're still nice people. We might have been divorced, but we weren't arch enemies either, you know, and there's not anyone else to help them. And I can do that, but it's amazing to me sometimes how our friends and acquaintances will question what we're doing or why we're doing it. And I've had two experiences, and I'd love to know if you guys have. They would ask the same question, like, how's your mom doing? And one team really wanted to know, and the other team just really wanted to say, well, she doesn't remember you, so just let her go. You don't have to visit, you don't have to do this. And what I found is they were doing that because they were so uncomfortable on how to help me or support me. And it was detracting from our relationship. And that the comfort was just so extreme. And that just shocked me to see these two different camps ask the same question, but for totally different reasons. And it just became very evident that it was their emotional coping skill. It's kind of like when somebody gets divorced. Well, I'm going to go on this side and I'm going to walk away from this side. That's kind of how I related that situation. Have you guys seen that or experienced that with yourselves or your clients?
Where I thought you were going to go with it, Lori, is there are people who ask, how's your mom? How are you doing? And the truth is, what they want to hear is fine, right? They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to hear more than that, and because honestly, they're not that interested. Or, as you point out, the whole idea of dementia is so frightening to them. And lots of people say that it's almost like they have a magical belief that it's somehow contagious. That if they get too close to you or to someone who's suffering from dementia, that it's going to inflict them or inflict their family. And so they want to be polite, but they don't really want to know. What you're describing is people taking it even further and saying, why don't you just basically park your mom in a nursing home and forget about her because she's not able to really relate to you anymore. And again, that has everything to do with their fears, as you're pointing out, and they're projecting their fears onto you and imagining what they would go through if they were in a similar situation.
Yeah.
It's true. Most of what people say is in giving advice or asking questions, it's about themselves. And most people, especially if they haven't been around someone with dementia, they're terrified by it.
I would agree. Now, you guys had teenage children during your caregiving years. How did it affect them? And before you answer that, how much did you really let them know? Because there's a lot of families that go, no, I'm going to protect my kids. I might ask them to watch them. I might ask them to do a task, but I'm not really going to tell them any details because they don't need to know that. They're just a kid. And I've seen kids get really frustrated with being left out on that and not knowing what to do because so many of them really do want to help. So, how did you guys deal with that? Julia, I'll let you take that first.
Our kids were very mature teenagers in many ways. And so we were pretty open about what was working, what was a struggle, what was frustrating us. And we gave them opportunities to interact. Our son actually, he would go over on his own after school because we had my in-laws a mile away from us. So he'd walk home from school and stop in there and sit with my mother-in-law, and they would talk. And they actually, it was one of the joys of her life at that time to have my son sit with her and ask her about her life. And he did a wonderful job. So I think the outcome, I think the idea is you share reasonably with your kids, not every single thing, but you let them know what's going on. And if there's an opportunity for them to help, it just allows them to be part of a caregiving family, and they can see how important and meaningful it is. And so that's what we hope our kids got out of it.
Barry, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think a lot of the decision about how involved kids should be has to do with, it really depends on their age. I mean, our kids were 14 and 17. They weren't babies. Um, I think the bigger issue for them was what, how were they going to be affected by time that we spent with their grandparents? Would they miss time with us? Would we not be able to do things for them? And I think that, in fact, was the case to some degree. There may be times when we couldn't drive them places or we couldn't have dinner with them. And I think they felt it. And I know that when we first sat down with them and said, we're moving your grandmother and Steve or my stepfather up from
Grandfather,
grandfather, great, up from Florida, they weren't like enthusiastic about this. They were sort of like a
I
little
think they were
apprehensive.
scared. I think
Yeah,
they were afraid.
they were apprehensive about how this would affect them. But I also think, as Julia points out, particularly our son got a lot out of it. I mean, first of all, their grandparents were lived in Florida most of their lives. they didn't really know them that well, other than to see them a couple times a year. And so our son got to know his grandmother in a way he had never had before, and that was really, I think, very helpful for him. And he was so wonderful with her. He could joke with her. He wouldn't react to her with as strongly as I would when she would say or do things that were irritating. I would get irritated. He would just sort of shrug it off. It wasn't. So he was great. He was her favorite by far.
Yeah, I think kids don't have the history. My daughter only knew her grandma with dementia, and I'll never forget. And she was when Danielle was real little. My mom still wanted to babysit, and Tom and I were like, "Oh, I don't know about that one," But it was like, "Okay, we're gonna make this work," and it'll be for a short period of time, and I'll have an activity for them to do, and I'll bring them some McDonald's or whatever. And I'll never forget coming back, and the two of them are sitting at the dining room table. And as I walked, just into the doorway, they both held up their pictures. You couldn't tell who was prouder, the 3-year-old or my mom, of their picture. And they were just like in glee. They were just so joyful. And they were just two peas in a pod having fun, because kids want to engage, they want to learn, they don't hold grudges, they don't see the differences a lot of times that we see. And like you said, they can learn so much to be compassionate and empathetic on this journey while giving so much joy, and then learning stories, learning more detail about who they're caring for. I think it's just a beautiful thing, for that inclusion. And then as the kids get older, they're on the computers, and some of these kids, they're developing apps and different things to help. I've seen Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. One Boy Scout, Eagle Scout, built a huge freshwater fish tank. He raised $10,000, and he was mentored by a man in an assisted living who was a craftsman, and he got mentored by a freshwater fish tank guy, and they donated this thing to a senior housing because his grandma was there and she liked to watch the fish, and he wanted that there. Another girl, her and her best friend both had grandparents that had dementia, but they never talked about it. And then one mentioned it, and they said they came up with a book to gather stories and questions to ask. And so the creativity and the involvement and the power of feeling purposeful and helpful, I think, is just such an opportunity that we don't want to lose with our kids. For anyone who's just joining us, we have been talking with Barry Jacobs and Julia Mayer, who are both clinical psychologists, and they are the co-authors of the AARP Caregiver Answer Book, which has almost 150 questions that are really common to caregivers, and you need to pick this book up to help you on your journey. They have a website called caregiveranswerbook.com. They are on Julia's on Instagram. They're both on Facebook. They're both on Twitter or X, and both on LinkedIn as well. And I'm just going to give a quick shout out to my webmasters who I adore. I know that can be a place of stress and tension for a lot of people trying to get something off the ground or get something fixed. And Q for Good is just exceptional. I've had websites for many, many decades, and these guys just communicate so well, and they're so kind, and they dumb it down for me so I understand, because I really don't want to know the black hole. I just want it fixed so it's functional. So if you're looking for somebody, check out Q for Good. They are amazing. So I want to get back to our questions here, because I could talk to you guys all day long, but we have a limited amount of time. And so, Barry, I'm interested in knowing your opinion. So many people care for loved ones. And loved ones, with dementia or something else, they're labeled caregivers, but a lot of people are reluctant of that title, and they're reluctant to find support services. What do you say to them, and why does that happen?
I mean, it happens because number one, I think, as you pointed out earlier, most people think of themselves as dutiful daughters, dutiful sons, dutiful husbands, dutiful wives, and they don't think that what they're doing is all that special. And especially with dementia, when it's a slowly progressing disease. At the beginning, it may be you just go over and bring groceries, or you help mow the lawn, or later on you do a little bit more, and then it kind of grows over time as the person's disease progresses. So people are still thinking of themselves as just a family member. They don't think of themselves as having this special status as a quote unquote caregiver. I think the other piece of this is that they don't want to have a special status because it brings attention to them and their needs that they feel guilty about. They say things like, don't ask about my needs. I'm not the one who's got dementia. Ask about his needs. Let's talk about him. And so the idea that a caregiver has some special status, special identity, and that they're then support services specifically for caregivers doesn't sit all that comfortably with a lot of people. And so, but the problem is, people who don't identify as caregivers typically don't avail themselves of those caregiver support services. And if they don't use the services, then they're not as likely to be able to sustain themselves over the length of time that dementia caregiving usually goes on. And usually goes on. I mean, we're talking years. We're talking, a good 7, 8 years on average, and it could be a lot longer. So we talk with folks about how important it is to understand that whether they want to wear the label or not, that that this caregiving can be stressful, and it could also be, but that there are resources available if they're willing to look into them, and that what they do for themselves, they're in fact doing for the person that they're caring for. So I can go on and on and on about this, but I mean, Julia, what do you want to add to that?
One of the reasons why it's important to acknowledge that you're a caregiver is because it is a lonely business over time, in particular when you're caring for someone with dementia. Unfortunately, as we were saying before, it frightens people who aren't familiar. Some of the friends drift away. If you're a spousal caregiver, the couple friends drift away, and it gets very isolating. And if you consider yourself a caregiver, then you might be willing to go online and look at any number of online caregiving support groups, including AARPs, which is tremendously huge. And and then you can see other people doing the same thing that you're doing. And if you're going to bed frustrated, feeling like I wish I hadn't yelled and I'm going to try better tomorrow, but every night I say this to myself, you could at least learn that other people are doing the exact same thing and they're having the same exact frustrations. It absolutely helps caregivers sustain the process. And the whole goal is to do the best care you can for your loved one. And the only way you can do that is if you get your own needs met as well.
I agree. I think denial is so huge. We see that, like Barry said, as kind of a natural role, son, daughter, spouse. But it's also, oh my gosh, if I admit this, then we got a problem, and where's the red phone? Because I might need it, but I don't even know who I'm going to call when I pick it up or who's going to be there. And then the resources, I think, and I found this for myself, and this is how I got into this space, was like, where the heck are they? Why aren't I getting connected to services, products, and tools? I think our physician offices really need to change their setup and have an ecosystem that has, I don't care if it's a social worker or a volunteer, that connect people to services, products, and tools, because there's a ton of them out there, but no one's connected to them in totality. There's the government agencies, there's the profit, there's the nonprofit, and then there's the people in the trenches who have written books and have YouTube channels and have started support groups that don't even see themselves as a resource because, my God, they're not a company, but they're the ones that can really, I think, in many ways give a calmness and a comfort to adapting to this life, and where they feel accepted and acknowledged for the range of feelings that they have. Because I think so often we feel we have to stuff them. Like, I can't show that. I can't show that I'm angry or I'm so depressed I'm going to pop, and we hide it and we put on this face, and then people look at us like, oh, they got it under control. and you're ready, to blow a gasket, but you're ashamed that you're in that route. But I think it's a kind of a societal setup in terms of how we do that. And I know years ago, and that was the common thing, but you think of how many times did you hear of years ago somebody was in the room upstairs locked in, especially when it came to someone dealing with cognitive issues. And we don't have moms that stay home in many of our families anymore. And we don't have our family all kind of in a close knit neighborhood. They're all over the world. And so things have drastically changed. Even our churches and religious communities are online, so much of them now, especially since COVID. So that is really important. I think the support group aspect is important. And I will just give my reluctance of going. And this is what I said to myself: I don't have time to do one more thing for my mom. I didn't see it for myself. I saw it as another thing on my to-do list for her. And I got there accidentally to hear a friend speak, and he got sick and didn't show up. And then I'm like stuck in this support group. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm coming back. I had no idea what I would hear in that. And to me, there must have been a stigma in my mind of going to a support group, and didn't realize the friendships and the bonds and the resources and the knowledge and just the acceptance level of these people get it, where a lot of times even our own family members don't get it because they're not as involved as a primary caregiver. And then I would also say too, what I found really interesting, and this is something on my Alzheimer's Speaks, I have a bunch of resources for people with dementia, but one of them kind of just came out of the blue, and people can submit poetry or articles. And what I have heard from people is those that aren't ready to go to a support group get a lot out of being able to read those articles and that poetry, because they're emotionally charged, and they can laugh and they can cry in private. Or the support groups, you can join like a Facebook group and be a voyeur. You don't have to make a comment. No one really needs to know you're there. And you can still glean a lot of information if you're not ready yet. And I think people don't understand that all the time. That and once they hear and see all these stories, and some they might agree with and some they might not, but hey, that's in the real world. Some people you click with, some people you don't. So it's not going to be any different there. So I think how do we get the resources into the clinics that can disseminate and point people into the right directions? I mean, if people are working with you two, where they are, you're working with AARP, and I'm sure you're very knowledgeable on a lot of things, but a lot of people aren't. And so, they go for their appointment, and then, they're just kind of fallen on the wayside, and people don't even know necessarily what terms to Google, to look for and stuff too. So I think that's a huge thing that we still have to overcome. Are there specific tips that you have for protecting a marriage through, this all-consuming journey of giving care? And Julia, I'll go to you first on that, because I know that's a concern for many. You need to protect your own home front as well.
Absolutely. It really comes down to communication. Like, you want to reaffirm that you are a team and that you are working together, even if one of you is doing a lot of caregiving and the other is not, let's say if my parent, but not Barry's. And you want to communicate about what each of you needs, and, try to talk about what is expected of you in terms of caregiving, what you want to accomplish, and you want your partner on board. Everyone doesn't have to do exactly the same thing. I think it works better if both partners have some role. Even the one whose parent it isn't could be doing the finances for that person, or mowing the lawn, like Barry said, or whatever, something so that everyone participates. But it really is about ongoing communication. And as the illness progresses for the care receiver, more conversation about how much care is needed, what kinds of supports you can put into place, what financial options there are. Your marriage should be your resource for helping you continue on that mission of caregiving.
Yeah, your resource and your rock. We all need our rocks where we feel safe, and sometimes through this process we can get really vulnerable and feel unsafe because we haven't protected ourselves and our being. Barry, what would you like to add to that?
I love Julie's response, and I think communication really is key. I just would add that, through adversity, relationships are either strengthened or weakened. And there are things, there are risks that they'll be weakened if people are critical of one another, if they're unkind to themselves, if they're not patient. But I think by seeing themselves as a team and really supporting one another, I do think the relationship is strengthened. I think the marriage comes out better in the end, and becomes part of the shared history of the couple that we did this, and it wasn't easy, but it was really important for us to do this, and it really has made us a stronger team as well as stronger individuals.
Well, and don't you think through the journey, as a couple, as a family, as friends, however you're, coping with this caring role, it gets you thinking about how do you want to be cared for, and it makes those questions easier to ask and to answer in a thoughtful process. I just think that we don't talk about that until crisis hits, and then that makes it so much more comfortable or uncomfortable and so much more stressful. And if we can give some thought about how do we really want to live life, the good, the bad, the ugly, the controllable, the uncontrollable pieces of it, and have somebody in our corner, I mean, that's to me a huge, huge benefit and a really smart way to live. And yet I see so many people, being afraid of, doing the wills and the healthcare directives and the powers of attorney because if I do those, I'm on my way out. Well, we're all on our way out. We just don't know when or how that's going to happen. And you had also mentioned, patience. That's the number one thing that I hear from all caregivers is, where could I buy a jug of patience? Because I'm losing it and I don't like not being a gracious care partner. And they call themselves up and they beat themselves up so bad on that. And, none of us are perfect, and we're going to have our good days and our bad days. And I think many times we push ourselves too far trying to get it all done when maybe it doesn't all need to get done that day or in that way. Well, I just want to thank you both for being with us. I think you have just given us such great value. I do want to, point out and point people to the AARP Caregiver Answer Book. This is absolutely fantastic. They have questions on welcome to caregiving, or chapters, I should say, taking care of yourself, communicating with dignity, caring for a parent or a partner, caring for someone with cognitive impairment, day-to-day caring at home. I mean, the list goes on and on. I know you'll find this as a beautiful resource, and you'll probably call it your personal Bible to help you out when things get frustrating. So again, thank you so much for your time. You can find in the show notes information in terms of how to connect with them via their website, caregiveranswerbook.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Lori.
Yeah, thank you. Really a pleasure, Lori.
Thank you. So in wrapping up, I just want to remind people to check out Alzheimer Speaks and all of our free educational resources. might want to check out our book too, Betty the Bald Chicken, Lessons in How to Care. It helps having those conversations about how do you want to be cared for? How does someone else want to be cared for? How do we include our children in this? It's actually written as a children's book, but all ages have really enjoyed this and said it's helped open up the door. And then our sister company, Dementia Map, is again also a wonderful resource. There's over 150 categories that you can search. There are things for education, there are activities, there's terminology, there's services, there's wonderful articles, and a calendar of events as well. So thanks for now, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.